The most amazing thing about pretty much every operating system out there today is that they all come with beautiful graphical user interfaces. I don't care if you're a Windows person, if you're a Mac person, or a Linux person, every single one of these operating systems come up with beautiful GUIs that allow us to do everything from reformatting hard drives to killing processes to watching events that are taking place on our system. Collectively, these things have done a pretty good job, but there's a problem. The problem is that you're only as good as your GUI if that's all you've got. The graphical user interface tools that come with all of our different operating systems are wonderful. They're powerful tools, but you're only as good as the GUI. But sometimes you need more than what that GUI can offer. Sometimes you need to be able to drill down. It's almost as though we need to peel away all of this graphical user interface and instead use the command line interface. That's the beauty of the command line interface. The command line interface simply says, look, oh, great powerful Windows computer or Mac computer, I don't need all the GUIs because I'm going to type stuff in directly from a command line. Now, when we say a command line, first of all, it's going to look something like this. So if you take a look here, this is on a Windows system, and I'm running a particular type of command shell, I'll explain that in a minute, called CMD, and I can just type commands in here, and then I'll get the results of it. You can see the prompt is now ready for me to do something else, and I can like clear the screen, stuff like that. Whoops. There we go. So the command line interface is going to manifest with different shells depending on the operating system. In the Windows world, we have two different kinds of shells. We have the classic CMD or command shell, which I just showed you, which is ancient but still there. And then we have PowerShell, which has been around for a while, and it's usually what most people turn to when they want to do more advanced things. So for example, here with my regular old command prompt, and by the way, it's black because I like that black background, that's the default. I can change that. I can type in a number of simple commands like that dir you just saw. Over here with PowerShell, I can type in that dir command. That works just fine, but I can also type in very complicated commands that are way outside the scope of the old style command shell and get really cool stuff done. Like what I'm doing right here is I'm literally pulling up the event log for this particular system. Shells are all over the place. And by the way, we also have shells within the Mac and the Linux world too. In fact, you got to remember that Mac is actually a form of Unix. So the shells in Linux and the shells in Macs look a lot alike. So for example, here's an example of a shell on a Mac. And we actually call this particular type of shell a bash shell. We can do this same shell here in a Linux system. You take a look here, yeah, there's a few different things in terms of the prompt itself, but they're basically the same exact type of shell. Now, we have all these different shells, but the programs we actually run to get these are called terminal programs. So most of these are built into our individual computers, but we also see terminal programs with names like, for example, SSH is built into a lot of systems. So if I want to get to somebody else's shell far away, I can run things like SSH. So the bottom line is that there's lots of different kinds of shells out there. I'm hoping that for most of y'all, this is pretty old information, but yeah, it's on the exam, so I definitely want to cover that. Now, I'm going to save the heavy lifting of all the many different types of command line interfaces, commands that you're going to see on the exam to Dan. However, there's a couple I'd like to get us started with, and that is ping and ipconfig. Keep in mind that there are lots of commands that are unique to particular shells. For example, a moment ago, I tried typing in an incorrect command to clear a screen because it was actually for a different type of shell. Whereas, I type it in the right way and then it works. However, there are lots of commands, in particular, ping is the best example I want to bring up to you, that work on all shells. All of the different shells support ping. Now, they might support it in slightly different ways, but in this particular case, I can run ping on a Windows machine, on its shells. I can run ping on a Linux box, on a Mac, and it's always going to work. So let's go ahead and start with just a couple of basic things with good old ping. So here we are in PowerShell, and I'm just going to type our first command line interface command, ping. And if I type ping by itself in a Windows environment, it's basically like, you don't run ping by itself, so we're going to open up help so you can figure out what you're trying to do here. So instead, what I'm going to try is I'm going to run ping, and normally I'm going to type in the IP address of another system. So I'm going to go ahead and type in. I just happen to know what the systems are on my network here. So you can see I type in ping and then an IP address, and you can see that I'm getting replies, which are telling me that I've got a good ping. Ping is like the #2 Phillips screwdriver of networking. If I can ping another system, I know that we're physically connected somehow, even if it's wireless. I've got a layer 1 connection. I know that my TCP/IP is all configured properly, and I know that the other system is actually up and running. Ping is a wonderful, powerful tool that we use as a quick way to send one ping only. I love you, Sean Connery. Over to another system to make sure it's alive and kicking. All right? So what I want to do now is let's do ping again, but watch it. This time I'm going to do it a little bit differently. All right, so this time I'm just going to type in ping. Now, what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to type in -T, and then I'm going to type in that address one more time. And I want you to watch what's happening here. Now, as I run the ping this time, before when we ran it, and you can still see it on the screen, it ran 4 times. This time, it runs absolutely continuously. On a Windows system, ping only runs 4 times and then stops. If you want ping to run continuously on a Windows system, you got to do that ping -T. By the way, on Macs and Linuxes, ping runs continuously all the time by default. So ping's a great way to verify that we can get a good connection to another system. Do keep in mind that it's not that hard to set up a firewall on the remote system that says, I'm going to block all pings. So anytime you're playing with ping, especially when you're on a local area network, the first thing you want to check if your ping isn't working is, does the remote other system have a firewall that's blocking the pings? So you definitely want to check that. However, there's one more kind of fun thing we can do with ping, and that is something we can use to check good old DNS. Watch this. So this time I'm going to type ping, and what I'm going to do, instead of typing in an IP address, I'm just going to type in a fully qualified domain name for some computer somewhere out there in the world. Now, in this particular case, there's a couple of things that are kind of interesting. First of all, when you look at this, you go, ooh, request times out. This failed. Whether it failed or not is unimportant to me. I want you to look at that first screen, that first line. You see where it says pinging www.total7.com and there's an IP address? The reason it has an IP address is because your DNS server is working. So many people, they're like, is my DNS working or not working? I just run ping on a DNS name. I don't use an IP address. I just ping www.total7.com and it resolved it. People go, well, Mike, it failed. You got all these request times out. Yeah, probably. I will pretty much guarantee you that the server at www.total7.com has a firewall in it that blocks pings. But the DNS still worked, didn't it? Ping is the danger we run into, especially when you're getting at the Security Plus level and beyond, is that you're going to start learning about more and more amazing tools. Folks, when it comes to great tools, never forget the basics. And ping, which works on every shell out there, is probably your first thing to go to whenever you need to do some initial diagnostics. Ping is great, but there's another command I want to show you. Now, this command is unique to Windows, and it's basically a how is my system set up in terms of TCP/IP. And this command is called ipconfig. Let me show you ipconfig in action. So here in PowerShell, I'm just going to type ipconfig by itself. Now, when you type ipconfig by itself, it's going to give you a lot of information about your network. So my DNS suffix, the name of my network, is called total home. Here's the IPv6 address. I've got temporary addresses. Windows likes to spin up lots of temporary IPv6 addresses. Here's my link local IPv6 address, just for this system. Here's my IPv4, subnet mask, default gateway, both in IPv6 and IPv4. So just running ipconfig by itself is such a powerful tool. Oh, by the way, in a Linux and a Mac world, you can run ifconfig. It works pretty much the same way. If you think that you have a connectivity problem on your system, the first thing you run is ipconfig or ifconfig. Do you have a legitimate IP address? Is your default gateway set up? Just running this command answers those questions for you. I can't tell you how many times I've run into technicians and they're like, oh, we got this complex problem. I come walk in and I go, does it have the right IP address? And by typing ipconfig, you can get those answers. I know everybody wants to take these courses and you're going to have me and Dan show you all these amazing, powerful tools. The reality is that 90% of all network problems can probably be fixed with ping and ipconfig/ifconfig. Okay, let's get back into ipconfig. There's some extra things we can run with this to make it a little bit more powerful. In particular, what I show you are switches. So a switch is nothing more than commands we add to the end. So I'm going to do ipconfig just like we did before, but this time watch what's going to happen. I'm going to put /all. That is a switch. And when I run it, I want you to compare. You see what we have in there when we type ipconfig by itself. Watch what happens when we do ipconfig/all. So what's happening here is you get a lot more information. First of all, here's information about the system itself. In particular, the host name, your DNS suffix. The rest of the stuff I'm not going to sweat. But what's important here, more than anything else, is all this extra information you get on ipconfig/all versus just regular ipconfig. In particular, the one I want you to take notice of is the third line. Physical address right there, that's your MAC address. Don't let simple questions on CompTIA exams fool you. If you type ipconfig by itself, you don't get a lot of information. In particular, if you want to see the MAC address, type ipconfig/all. Okay, the other thing that ipconfig is really great for is dealing with DHCP and DNS. Let's start off with DHCP. Now, when I say DHCP, what I'm talking about is when you have your initial DHCP lease and whatever your system's connected to, sometimes you want to unhook from that DHCP and connect to a new one, or you just want to refresh it. And that's where commands like ipconfig release and ipconfig renew are really, really handy. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to type ipconfig and I'm going to type /release. By typing this, I literally have disconnected my computer from the DHCP server. Notice I don't have, if I type ipconfig right now, I don't have any IPv4 address. I have IPv6 because IPv6 doesn't use DHCP. But let's go ahead and get reconnected. So I'm just going to, and by the way, I'm hitting the up arrow key to bring these old commands back. So notice I've typed in ipconfig renew. Now we usually have to wait a moment. And it pops back up, and you can now see that we now have our IPv4 addresses back and ready to go. I don't know about you, but I love watching the British comedy, The IT Crowd, and the famous guy who picks up the phone and says, have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? So many issues that take place with networks can often be fixed by just running an ipconfig release and then ipconfig renew. If you're staying connected to the same DHCP server, then you can usually just type ipconfig renew. But when in doubt, just type release and renew, and you can take care of all that. Yes, there's other ways to do it, some even graphically, but I want to make sure you're comfortable with ipconfig release and renew. Okay, the last thing I want to do is I want to go back to ipconfig, except this time I want to deal with DNS. Now this is interesting, because I've already showed you one command, ping, that can help with DNS. Now I'm about to show you how ipconfig, which seems to be just showing me my IP address information, also helps with DNS. Keep in mind that every Windows, Linux and Macs do this too, although they don't use the ipconfig command. All hosts will store DNS information. So you go up there and type in www.ithinkmikemyers and danlechanceramazing.com, you hit enter, that's going to give you an IP address, right? And it will keep this in a cache, and sometimes that can cause problems. So we can actually run ipconfig with certain switches to deal with this. In particular, if you want to empty that DNS cache, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So I'm going to type in ipconfig, except this time I'm going to type in flush DNS. Ta-da! I know it doesn't look like much, but this is an incredibly important tool that so many people ignore. If you think you're having DNS issues, this is the first command I'm going to run every single time. By the way, if you want to, you can actually right-click on any one of your network devices and select reset, and it will do all this for you graphically. But I like doing it this way because I have very, very tight controls. Okay, so I've only shown you 2 commands, and Dan is going to take the next number of episodes and go through all the other type of command line commands you're going to be seeing on the Security Plus. And by the way, I almost don't even care about the Security Plus in this point. These are commands that all security people should know. You should just know these. So yes, it's great for the exam, but also these are the basic type of commands that every security tech should be able to do right off the top of their heads.